Welcome to another special edition of Daily Dose of Septuagint. This time around, we're going to take a look at another book, and in this case, it's a forthcoming one, or one that is just now being released, depending on when and where you're watching this video. And the topic here is going to be the broad field related to the use of the Old Testament in the New Testament, one of the most fertile and productive fields in New Testament scholarship at the present, although it's also bled into the use of the Old Testament in the Old Testament as well. There's been a lot of work on that. And in recent years, there has been an avalanche of books and other kinds of resources in this particular field. And I'm just going to show a few of them. So you've got the somewhat recent Dictionary of the New Testament, Use of the Old Testament by Beale, Carson, Glad, and Naselli. Of course, the classic commentary on said matters by Beale and Carson. Beale's Handbook on the New Testament, Use of the Old Testament, and I just, for the sake of self-promotion, threw my own in there. So Old Made New, a more layperson accessible guide to all of this. And there's been a lot more. The somewhat recent Hensley Lincecum collected volume, all the stuff by Richard Hayes, and a whole boatload of people. So there's been a lot of work on this. And so you may be wondering, well, why have more? And I certainly felt the same way as well. But one of the gaps in the market, in my opinion, is a critical resource that will help people who want to study this kind of field get the raw data. And sort of filling that gap is a new book that is coming out, currently slated for April 2026, so hopefully around the time this video launches, called Israel's Scriptures in the New Testament, a Critical Synopsis, edited by myself and Will Ross, and put out by Hendrickson Academic. And so I want to give you an overview of what this book is and what sort of contribution it makes to the work in this field and so forth, give you a little test drive through how it looks, and also preview some other stuff to come. So let's dig into what exactly is this particular book. Well, the basic premise behind this resource, and this is the reason why we call it a critical synopsis, pertains to the accessibility and usability of the raw data. If you want to do work in this area and you want to trace out how Israel's scriptures show up in various New Testament passages, which tends to be the focus for most folks in this vein, what you really have to do it right is you got to be able to study it in Hebrew, any given passage, whether Isaiah 40 or whatever. You got to be able to study it in the Septuagintal form, or other potential types of Greek forms. So it may not just be the quote-unquote Septuagint. And then you got to study it in Greek in the New Testament, of course. And then you have the issue of English translations tend to be done by different committees, and so you have you'll have the Hebrew translation, and that might be kind of in different sorts of philosophy. Same thing, you got either Netz or Lexham for the Septuagint translation, both of which have their pros and cons. You got different translations on the Greek New Testament side, but then you also, so that creates a lot of noise. Then you also have a boatload of variants in all three. So there could be Dead Sea Scroll might have something else for a given passage, or lots of Septuagint variations. You got obviously a huge apparatus for the passages in the Greek New Testament. And then if you're following something like the Beale's methodology, if you're going to kind of do it right, you also have to look at Second Temple Jewish sources to the extent that they are available and so forth that draw on the same passage. So if Paul cites from this passage of Isaiah, maybe it's also used by Philo or someone like that. Now, if you've ever looked into the price of these kinds of volumes or their accessibility, you're dealing with a lot of money and a lot of time. I was just pricing these out. The Göttingen editions for the Septuagint have gone way up. We're talking like $400 just for Genesis. It's outrageous. Not easy to come by, even if you have the Logos versions. Same thing, you got to have a BHS plus some sort of edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls to maybe help you up, get an updated set of Qumran variants. Same thing on the Greek New Testament. The ECMs are coming out. They're pricey. So it's a lot of money to do this work, a lot of time. And unless you have a very good library, it's very difficult to do it right when it comes to the primary texts themselves. So what we thought we would do, and this was in partnership with Hendrickson, as we kind of worked out and framed this, is say, well, what if we took all the raw data and put it in one place? Of course, it's not as good as having a whole library of the critical editions and so forth, but at least you could have a better starting point. So that's the main contribution of this particular volume, is giving you access to the data so that you can then go and do the work. So this book is not arguing a thesis. It's a resource for your library. It's not saying, hey, this is Paul's use of Deuteronomy or what have you. That's been done a lot. It's if you want to actually do this right, here's the data that you need to do it with. So that's the basic principle. Let's take a look at kind of how we structured the book. We decided in this case to go Old Testament book by Old Testament book. And so we begin with Genesis 1, we go Genesis 2, Genesis 3. Of course, we don't include every chapter because not every chapter is used in the New Testament. And then what we'll see is, okay, where is any verse from Genesis 1, for example, used in the New Testament? Okay, well, Matthew 19, Mark 10, John 1, 2 Corinthians 4, and so on. Same thing with Genesis 2. You see a lot more uses of that. And so it could be verse 1 or 5 or what have you. And essentially what that means is you're going to open this book and say, all right, now I am in 2 Samuel whatever. Okay, where is that used in the New Testament? Or if it's not used, then it simply won't be in this book. And of course, many chapters are not. Moreover, what we decided to do in the spirit of having it be a very useful long-term volume for you is we've included the best we can find them. There are some indices for these kinds of things, but sometimes it's hard to track these down. Where are the same verses or the same passages like Genesis 1 or Genesis 2, Genesis 3 used in Second Temple literature chiefly, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or Ben Sira, Sirach, Jubilees, Philo, Josephus, Aristobulus, whatever it might be. Now, sometimes a chapter is not used, so far as we can tell, in any Second Temple passage, but to the extent that we can find them, we included those as well. And so the benefit of this layout is that, and like let's say you're preaching through an Old Testament passage, or an Old Testament book, you can say, oh, okay, I'm in the middle of Isaiah. Let me see if there are any New Testament uses of this chapter in Isaiah so that I can be aware of that, might integrate it into my sermon or what have you. And so this readily enables you to do that. Moreover, what we found particularly fascinating about this, given that we go in Old Testament order but then include all the New Testament passages, is that it becomes by kind of default an apostolic commentary on these verses or this chapter. So what were the synoptic evangelists thinking? How does Jesus interact with these? What's their take on it? And be able to compare. So, okay, how does Paul in 1 Corinthians use a given verse, and how might that be similar or different than, say, Matthew or what have you? You're able to compare and contrast and do that kind of work. And on top of that, do the same thing with the Second Temple literature. So, for instance, it's not on the screen here, but you get to Genesis 15, the covenant situation there with Abraham and his imputed righteousness. And so Paul, of course, engages with that in Romans and Galatians, but then you also see it, for instance, in 1 Maccabees, and it's quite different. Or the book of James and so forth. So you can do that kind of work. So that's the basic structure as we go Old Testament chapter. Then we will, and I'll show you this here in a second, we show you what New Testament passages engage that and what extra biblical passages do as well. When we include the New Testament passages, and a big part of this is figuring out which ones to actually include, we structure things according to a fairly simple rubric. We have citations, quotations, and allusions. And if you follow the field, this is where a lot of the debate lies, although I'm not sure it's the most helpful area of debate. But what we label a citation are places where you have a lot of wording of, say, Genesis 1, whatever, and there's an introductory formula, such as it is written, or something to that effect. So we call that a citation. A quotation is basically the same kind of vibe, only there is no formula. But you'll have extensive wording. It's very clear it's coming from this or that passage, but there's no, it stands in Scripture or according to Isaiah or whatever. So you don't have that. So we call that a quotation. And then allusion is going to be, of course, more indirect. It's maybe less extensive. You clearly don't have an introductory formula, but so far as we can tell, there is a clear source text. Now, allusion, if you're engaged in this field, that's where most of the debate is. And for a volume like this, we intentionally erred on the side of a stricter way of defining allusion. And so for those who are maximalist and want to find allusions on every single page of whatever, and they see 1,000 different allusions in Revelation, what have you, they're going to be unhappy with our treatment. However, we have a reason for that. If we did that, this book would be 7,000 pages long. If someone simply says, for instance, David, right, if that's just somewhere in a New Testament passage, we're not typically going to include something like that because it's imprecise as to what source text there is. Or if it's just a vague phrase that shows up in 15 different places in the Old Testament, even if I believe that, there is an allusion there, including in this particular volume as a quote-unquote critical synopsis is not going to be terribly helpful because, again, you don't know which one it is and so forth. So, again, for the maximalists, they might be a little bit dissatisfied that we didn't include everything, but if we did, again, it would be like every chapter and it would be enormous. And so we're trying to focus on allusions that have a lot of consensus and you can trace it to a particular source text, because then you can actually do the work. You can say, let's compare the wording and let's see if there's alternate forms of it and that kind of thing. That's the point of this particular book within the spirit of a synoptic comparison between different types or readings of a given passage. So you can disagree with us on whether we should have been so restrictive. Certainly there are some that, we debated as to should we include it or not. We decided, either yay or nay. And so that was where the hard work was. But hopefully we included enough that most users will be satisfied. Well, with that, let's take a look at how this thing is laid out. Let's first take a look at kind of the zoomed out view here, and this is just the opening spread. You'll notice here, and I know it's not super zoomed in yet, but here we have Genesis 1 at the top. We have a little mini commentary, which I'll get to in a second, and then we start with the Old Testament data itself. And you'll see on the left we have the Hebrew, on the right we have the Old Greek. For the Hebrew, we use the Westminster Leningrad Codex Digital Text, which is, with only a few exceptions, essentially the BHS text, so that was straightforward. For the sake of rights and keeping this thing affordable, we did use the Sweet text for the Old Greek, as opposed to licensing Rolf's Honhart or certainly the Göttingen text. That would have made this thing very pricey. But I'll show you in a second that we do make up for that in the apparatus. And so you'll see we got the Hebrew and the Greek side by side. Now, the nice thing about that, and the reason why we did this, is that you can actually do a synoptic comparison of those. You're not just comparing it with the New Testament, but you can say, wait a second, where does the Septuagint sometimes differ from the Masoretic, and you can kind of do that work. You also notice that we're selective. We don't include the entire chapter because, again, this thing is already long enough, clocking in at about 700 pages. So we include the verses that we think are important for a user to have as context. So for the verses 1 through 5, we think, okay, that's important. And we skip down to 26, 27, and 28. And so we'll just use ellipses to show that there is a skip of some verses that are, of course, important, but for the sake of this volume, they're not necessarily vital. After we have the Old Testament stuff, we move in to the New Testament passages, and we go in the traditional order. So here's your Matthew, Mark, John, because there's nothing in Luke here, then 2 Corinthians and so forth, and if needed, we'll have a nice thick bar there to kind of separate the passages. And then we have the Second Temple stuff follow after that. So that's the kind of basic layout. Now, the reason why we did this is that we want to maximize your ability to have all of this Old Testament data and all of this New Testament data, if we can, in one sort of flat page display. And so actually each of the chapters starts on the sort of left-hand side and then continues into the right-hand side. That's intentional, so when you lay this book flat, you have all the data, or at least as much as we could. Sometimes, of course, it spills over to the next page. If there's a lot of New Testament passages, it'll have to go over to the subsequent pages, but we try to have it all there in one big flat spread. That was the main goal, to maximize your ability to do the kind of comparative work that you want to do. Let's zoom in a bit here just to show you a few more features. So here, with each chapter, we just provide we don't provide any sort of like, hey, Paul is engaging this typologically, and here's the thing that he's dealing. We don't do that. We'll save that for the monographs that cover it. All we simply do in this little initial box is say, here's a basic lay of the land for this chapter, where it shows up and why it's interesting, something like that. So it's typically just one sentence. We're trying not to go overboard here. Then you'll see that we got each verse nicely spaced out and so forth, so that you can compare them. And if something is part of the citation or quotation or allusion, we mark it with these little circled letters. The reason for that is we don't want you to get all confused with the verse numbers, because you're going to be in Matthew, and you might be in verse 10, and then to say it's verse 1 of Genesis 1:1, all that gets to be a bit of a headache. So the alphabetical little labels here will help you make those connections. So in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That's A, and we'll see in a second that A is going to show up in the receptor text to help you make that connection. Same thing here with B and so on. And so you can study at this level and say, well, let me read it in Hebrew, and then let me look at the Greek, and okay, well, it's interesting. He used poieo here as opposed to baral. That's kind of fascinating. What's going on with that? So you can do that kind of comparative work. So that's the Old Testament layout. Let's move and see sort of how it looks on the New Testament side of the coin. So if you sort of scroll down the page, you'll see here's a good example. I didn't include everything here, but here's Mark. We are using the Westcott-Hort text for the New Testament because, again, trying to keep the cost down. But again, we'll have the apparatus that I'll show you in a second that will make up for that. So here's your A. That's tying back to that verse that we saw. Also D, so it's a different part of it. So from the beginning, creation, so that's this kind of pointer back to Genesis 1:1, and then male and female, he made them, and so forth. Now we call this a citation because you have this sort of slightly fuzzy, he wrote to y'all the commandment, so that classifies this as a citation. Now you'll also notice, and one of the areas of research in this field has been the study of conflated or composite citations. The way we deal with that is in these embedded cross-references. So in Mark 10:2-9, not only do you have Genesis 1, which is the one that we're talking about, but you also have references to Deuteronomy 24, as well as, in this case, Genesis 2. So what we do is have these little bracketed pointers with the section number and the chapter number say, hey, this passage also shows up in that section, and it shows up in Genesis 2. But when you get there, you'll see that we change all this formatting. It'll be the exact same paragraph, but it'll have the formatting and so forth different because it's customized for that particular passage. So there's a lot of hyperlinking, if you will, when there are composite citations. Same thing with John 1. You got that's the A one, you got B here and so forth, all the sort of in the beginning, light, dark, all that kind of stuff. Referring back to the text of Genesis 1. You'll notice that when we think something is part of the citation, or in this case, an allusion, because there's no introductory formula, we will bold that text. Now, you may disagree sometimes with the boundaries of our bolding, but we tried to reflect the best we can the kind of consensus as to where a given citation begins and where it ends. One of the reasons why I have to use these alpha little circles is that you also have the verse numbers for this particular passage in Matthew. So we switched to that so that it was easier for you to track. Same kind of format once you get to the extra biblical or Second Temple stuff. So you can just see a little sample here. We got the Damascus document from Qumran, so we give you that in Hebrew. And given that underlining or bolding Hebrew is not great, so in these kinds of Semitic languages where boldface doesn't really work very well, instead we put it in this kind of gray font, but you still see the same lettering. Sirach here, we do have, in this particular case, we just have the Greek form. The Kairogeneza form in Hebrew doesn't exist for this particular passage, or it hasn't survived. And so you'll see we got the bolding, the letters, and so you can compare, okay, how does Sirach use Genesis 1 versus other New Testament uses. We got Jubilees, so we threw in some Ethiopic. There's also a bit of Syriac and some Latin and so on. So you see with the Ethiopic, we also had to do that gray typeface because the bold doesn't really work for Ethiopic. And so that, again, enables you to do some really serious scholarship with all the data at your disposal. Now, you'll notice that we don't include like all of Sirach 17. What we tried to do is pick the relevant context within which a given allusion or quotation fits so that you can at least do enough reading to figure out, okay, what's happening here, but we're not going to give you like the whole thing. And if we skip some verses, we do the ellipses as well. Just trying to manage that sort of delicate balancing act between we want to give you enough context and not just give you this. Like if we just gave you that, that's not super helpful. But if we gave you the entire chapter, that's going to be overwhelming as well. So we're trying to kind of balance a lot of different considerations and try to hit that sweet spot of what's enough to do this synoptic comparison. Now let's move on to the apparatus, which is probably the hardest part of this project, but for scholars at least, this will hopefully be one of the great benefits of it as well. Once you get to the end of the specific passages that are being used with the citation, that kind of thing, at the very bottom of that, you do have an apparatus, and we do include an apparatus of the Masoretic text, which is not as robust. There's not as many variants, but we might include appeals to the Samaritan Pentateuch. We'll have Dead Sea Scrolls, the Vulgate, Targums, and that kind of thing. It's just not, it's not always going to be for every chapter that you'll have a lot of relevant data. So we'll include that, and we set these sources off in this kind of grayish font. Now, I'll point out that we're not providing an apparatus for the entire chapter. What we do is we focus on the verses that are engaged in some sort of citation, quotation, allusion, unless there's something really significant that we want to draw out. Because again, we're trying to manage the amount of data that we hit you with, so it's not going to be a full apparatus. Moreover, given that a lot of editions will use different symbols and sigla to track manuscripts and so forth, we tried to simplify it and just give you the readings and where to go find them. If you're going to go the next level, you'll have to go, of course, and get the specific critical editions to sort of see what are the specific nuances. That's not as big of a deal with the Masoretic apparatus, but when you get to the Septuagint apparatus, which will follow the Old Greek, then it gets more complicated. And so we're going to deal with, like, what does Aquila say, or Symmachus. You also have, omissions, or just different manuscripts with different readings. So this is a good example. So the main text has epoiesin. Some manuscripts have eplasin, so that's like to form, and some have ktizo, which means to create. For the sake of managing the chaos, we don't tell you which manuscripts these are from, because if you ever look at the Göttingen apparatus, it is the Wild West. I cover it in some prior videos, and it wouldn't be terribly helpful for us to include all that information because it would just be way too enormous. Instead, we just say, hey, there's 2 readings here, and if you really want to go deeper, you got to go and get the Göttingen edition or what have you to kind of figure that out. Now, I mentioned that we used Sweet's edition because of licensing and all of that, and that is basically Vaticanus plus some other stuff. And so what we do is, if there is a variant in Sweet compared to Ross Honhart or the Göttingen edition, we will note that. And so you do actually have the full Rolf's text and you have the full Göttingen text. We'll always note that for the verses that we've included. And so you can at least figure out, okay, what's the difference between this and the Rolfs that I have on my shelf? And so that's the Old Testament apparatus. We also, on the Old Greek side, will include not just the Hexapla, but some of the later versions that are downstream from the Greek. What about the New Testament side? Same basic look and feel. We're not going to provide like, hey, this is in Alexandrinus or this is in Vaticanus, because again, it's going to get enormous. If you've looked at the ECM, I mean, the apparatus is 2/3 of the page most of the time. We just are focusing on the readings. However, we will use 3 main editions as a point of comparison. So given that we're using Westcott Hort as our base text, we will note where that differs from Nestle Aland, either Nestle 28 or the more recent ECMs. Robinson Pierpont, which we take as our main text for the Byzantine tradition, and the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. Those were the 3 that we chose. You'll even notice that we include the diamond readings that have entered into the ECM and so forth. But otherwise we'll just have, okay, here's a variant. Some manuscripts add an L2 or what have you, so you can at least see, okay, how does this stack up in the data set? And we just sort of flow that way. So that's the basic apparatus. We also have a few other indices, and so you'll notice at the end of the Old Testament index, which is how it's organized, we end up having 221 total Old Testament chapters running through Malachi 3. Then we'll have a New Testament index, and so it's sorted that way. So in Matthew 1, we got this stuff. Matthew 2, we got this stuff. So that's a different way. If you want to navigate it from that direction, you would use this index. And then, as you can expect, we also have the extra biblical index. Okay, here's all the different places these Dead Sea Scrolls show up. Now, on that, let me point out that we do not include all the places that the Old Testament is used in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That, again, would be an enormous book. We're focusing only on the ones that are used in the New Testament and then also in a Second Temple or extra biblical passage. So it's more narrow. It's not the entire thing, because a lot of times the Old Testament is used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that passage may not be used in the New Testament. So the New Testament kind of becomes the filter, if you will. Well, you may be wondering, I am rusty on my Ethiopic, or I'm rusty on my Hebrew. What do I do? Well, the good news is we are in the process of releasing an English synopsis as well. The critical synopsis, which is focused exclusively on the primary source languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, etc., that's kind of the first volume that is now out, or at least will be in April. I'm about halfway through. It's a bit of a one-man job. I'm about halfway through translating all of that to make an English synopsis. We're not going to have it be a sort of 2-volume set. You can pick one or the other or both. And so we don't have a release date of this second volume. You notice they are companions, similar style of the cover and so forth. And they will have the same pagination. It'll be organized the exact same way. So if you're in section 112, looking at a particular Old Testament passage, and it's on page 500, it's going to be the exact same place in the English volume. So they will track with each other. That took a lot of work to figure that out. But I'm hoping 2029 or 2028, we'll see. It's a tedious thing. Let me give you a little sneak preview of what it will look like. Here's just an excerpt of Genesis 3. The little mini commentary will be the same, but you'll notice that everything is in English. And so the Hebrew is over here in English, and the Greek is in English. And what we do is italicize places where the Septuagint appears to be deviating, or at least different from. It may not be deviating, it's just different from what we have in the Masoretic text. The New Testament passages are all in English, so you can trace that out. And I'm trying to do a very wooden translation so that even if you don't know Greek or Hebrew, you can say, all right, Paul here cites it in precise word order, or maybe not. I'm trying to reflect those kinds of differences as best I can within the limitations of English. Same thing for Philo and Josephus, which is an enormous pain to translate, but I'm trying to do it all fresh so that same lexical mapping, you can sort of compare them more easily. You can't just use, the Loeb edition, because they're going to translate things differently than I would in Romans or what have you. So it has to be kind of the mind of one translator to sort of keep everything in sync so that the same kind of words can be studied throughout in English. And I don't know if this has ever been done before, but I'm actually turning the critical apparatus into an English apparatus. And that has taken a lot of effort as well to try to get that right. To the extent that a textual variant can be reflected in English, not all of them can, but if it can, that we will include that in the apparatus as well. So that is a big task, but I hope that this will be a blessing to those who want to use this, either have both volumes on their shelf, or if your languages are rusty, you can get this English edition. But anyway, that is a little bit of a foretaste of what is to come. Hopefully within the next year and a half, that's my goal, but it's a heavy lift. Anyway, for now, we got the critical synopsis, and I hope you check it out, Israel's Scriptures in the New Testament. We hope it is a blessing for both the Academy and the church for years to come as a kind of one-stop starting point for future work on this kinds of stuff. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.